My name is Danielle Cho. I'm 36 years old. 3 weeks ago, a caseworker from Child Protective Services knocked on my door, following up on an anonymous report claiming I was neglecting my children, leaving them unsupervised for hours, failing to provide adequate meals, allowing my home to fall into unsafe, unsanitary conditions. I let her in immediately, understanding, with a specific, practiced calm, exactly what this kind of investigation required of me. I'd done this before, though never as the subject of the report. Halfway through her walkthrough of my home, the caseworker stopped in my hallway, staring at a framed certificate hanging near my kitchen, my state foster care license, current and active, the same credential that had allowed 6 different children to find safety in my home over the preceding 4 years. She looked at it for a long moment, then looked back at me, and said, quietly, "I think I need to ask you something. Are you the Danielle Cho who fostered the Ramirez sibling group 2 years ago?" I told her I was. She set down her clipboard and said, "I placed those kids with you myself." Her silent revenge stories. If you've ever been accused of the exact thing you've spent years working against, comment the audacity below. This one's for you. I'm a single mother to 2 biological children, Maya, 9, and Ethan, 6, and I've also served as a licensed foster parent for the past 4 years, opening my home to children in crisis during some of the most difficult, uncertain periods of their young lives. I want to describe why I became a foster parent, because I think it matters to understanding exactly how absurd the eventual accusation against me would turn out to be. I'd grown up, myself, in a household touched by genuine instability during my own early childhood, before an aunt had taken guardianship of me and provided the kind of steady, attentive care that had fundamentally shaped who I became as an adult. I'd always known, from a relatively young age, that I wanted to offer that same stability to other children eventually, once I had the resources and stability to do so myself. I'd completed the state's rigorous foster care licensing process nearly 5 years ago, a process that had included extensive background checks, home safety inspections, parenting classes, and ongoing training specifically focused on trauma-informed care for children coming from difficult circumstances. I want to describe, briefly, what that licensing process actually involved, because I think the specific rigor of it matters to understanding exactly how absurd it would eventually feel to have my basic parental competence questioned. The process included over 30 hours of mandatory training covering everything from childhood trauma responses to safe sleep practices to the specific legal responsibilities of a foster parent within our state's system. It included multiple home visits from licensing staff, detailed background checks not just on myself but on every adult regularly present in my household, and character references from people who could speak directly to my parenting and general reliability. By the time I received my actual license, nearly 5 years before the events of this story, I understood, intimately, exactly what a genuine child welfare investigation looked like, exactly what standards a home needed to meet, and exactly how seriously the state took the question of a child's safety and well-being. This background would become directly relevant, in ways I couldn't have anticipated, to how I processed and responded to the eventual, false accusation against my own household. I want to describe my actual, day-to-day household routine, because the contrast between this reality and the eventual neglect accusation matters enormously to understanding how baseless that accusation actually was. My children's days followed a structured, consistent schedule, school drop-offs and pickups I handled personally or coordinated carefully with trusted backup arrangements, meals planned and prepared with genuine attention to their nutritional needs, a home I maintained in clean, organized condition partly out of personal preference and partly, I'll admit, out of the specific vigilance that comes from knowing my home could be subject to inspection at any time given my foster care licensing status. I worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, a career choice I deliberately pursued specifically because it allowed me the flexibility to be genuinely present for my children throughout their days, rather than relying heavily on childcare arrangements that might have left them in less consistently supervised circumstances. I want to introduce Linda, my next-door neighbor for the preceding 3 years, because understanding our actual relationship matters to understanding both her eventual accusation and her apparent motivations for making it. Linda and I had never been particularly close, though our interactions had generally been cordial in the ordinary way suburban neighbors manage without deep friendship, waves across the yard, occasional brief conversations about neighborhood matters, nothing suggesting any particular animosity that I'd been aware of throughout our years living beside each other. I'd noticed, over the preceding several months, a specific shift in Linda's demeanor toward me, though I hadn't fully understood its cause at the time. She'd become noticeably cooler in our interactions, offering shorter, more clipped responses to what had previously been ordinary friendly exchanges, though I'd attributed this shift to her own personal stress rather than anything specifically related to me or my family. I want to describe, briefly, the general presence of foster children in my home over the preceding years, because I believe this context directly relates to understanding what may have actually motivated Linda's eventual complaint. Over 4 years of fostering, I'd cared for 6 different children or sibling groups, each placement varying in length from several weeks to, in one case, nearly a year, before children were either reunified with their biological families or moved to more permanent placements. This meant that my household composition had changed periodically throughout the years Linda and I had lived beside each other, sometimes just my 2 biological children, sometimes additional foster children present as well, a fluctuation that, I now suspect, may have contributed to some confusion or judgment on Linda's part about my household and parenting more broadly. I want to note, specifically, that at the time of Linda's eventual complaint, I did not currently have any foster placements. It was just Maya and Ethan in my home, a detail that would become relevant to understanding exactly how disconnected her accusation was from my actual, current household reality. I want to describe, in some detail, the specific placement that Sarah would later reference during her walkthrough of my home, because understanding this history matters enormously to how the entire situation eventually resolved. 2 years before this story's central events, I'd fostered 3 siblings, the Ramirez children, ages 4, 7, and 9 at the time, who'd arrived at my home following a genuinely difficult removal from a household experiencing serious, sustained neglect. I remember the specific condition these children were in when they first arrived: underweight, guarded, unaccustomed to consistent routines or predictable meals, carrying the particular wariness that develops in children who've learned, early and painfully, that adults can't always be relied upon. I'd worked, over the following 8 months these children remained in my care, to rebuild exactly the kind of stability and trust that had been absent from their earlier home: consistent mealtimes, predictable routines, patient, trauma-informed responses to the specific behavioral challenges that often accompany a child's early experience of neglect. I remember Sarah, who'd served as their caseworker throughout that placement, visiting regularly to monitor their progress, watching alongside me as these 3 children gradually transformed from guarded and anxious into considerably more secure and settled. This was the history, apparently, that Sarah recognized the moment she saw my foster license hanging in my hallway, not an abstract credential, but a specific, remembered record of exactly the kind of care I'd provided to children who'd needed it most urgently. I want to describe a specific incident, roughly a month before the CPS report, that I believe became the actual catalyst for Linda's complaint, since understanding this moment matters to understanding the genuine pettiness underlying what would become a genuinely serious, formal accusation. Linda's own child, a boy roughly Ethan's age, had gotten into a disagreement with Ethan at a neighborhood gathering, a minor, ordinary childhood conflict over a shared toy that had ended with both boys in tears before the adults present had intervened and resolved things reasonably quickly. I'd handled the situation, in the moment, by gently redirecting both boys and having a brief, age-appropriate conversation with Ethan about sharing. Linda, I later learned, had felt I'd handled the situation unfairly, favoring my own son over hers in how I'd managed the conflict. She'd apparently mentioned this frustration to several other neighbors in the weeks following the incident, a detail I only learned about much later, once the fuller picture of her escalating resentment became clear. I want to describe the actual day the caseworker arrived at my home, because the specific, disorienting shock of that visit mattered enormously to everything that followed. I was working at my kitchen table, Maya and Ethan both at school, when I heard a knock at my door. The woman who introduced herself, Sarah Mitchell, a caseworker with our county's Child Protective Services office, explained, carefully and professionally, that her office had received an anonymous report alleging neglect in my household, and that state regulations required her to conduct a formal welfare check and interview as a result. I want to describe the specific, complicated feelings this visit generated in me, genuine professional respect for the process, given my own understanding of exactly why such investigations matter and how seriously they need to be taken, layered against a specific, personal distress at being the subject of an investigation rather than, as I'd been for years, someone whose home represented safety for children experiencing exactly this kind of crisis. I want to describe the specific allegations Sarah outlined, because their particular details matter to understanding exactly how fabricated and exaggerated they would eventually prove to be. The anonymous report claimed I regularly left my children unsupervised for extended periods, sometimes hours at a time, while I was out running errands or otherwise occupied. It claimed my home was frequently in unsafe, unsanitary condition, citing specific examples of clutter, spoiled food, and general disorder. It claimed my children appeared, on multiple occasions, hungry and inadequately dressed for weather conditions. I want to be direct about my reaction to hearing these specific claims, because none of them bore any resemblance to my actual household or parenting practices. I'd never left my children unsupervised for any significant period. As a work-from-home parent with a structured routine, I was, if anything, more consistently present with my children than many working parents manage to be. I want to describe the actual process of Sarah's home walkthrough, because I think the specific, methodical nature of this investigation illustrates how thoroughly it would eventually contradict everything the anonymous report had claimed. I invited Sarah in immediately, offering full, unrestricted access to every room in my home, understanding, from my own professional experience with exactly this kind of investigation, that genuine transparency and cooperation represented the most effective response to any allegation, particularly one I knew to be entirely false. Sarah moved through my home methodically, checking the kitchen for evidence of adequate food supplies, checking bedrooms for appropriate, clean sleeping arrangements, generally assessing the overall condition and safety of the space in the careful, professional manner I recognized from my own years of experience preparing my home for exactly this kind of inspection as part of my foster licensing requirements. I want to describe the specific moment Sarah's attention shifted toward my foster care certificate, because this moment represented the actual turning point that would eventually, definitively transform the entire trajectory of this investigation. We'd moved into my hallway, near the small home office space where I kept several framed documents, my graphic design degree, a few family photos, and, prominently displayed, my current foster care license, a certificate I'd always kept visible partly out of genuine pride in the work it represented and partly as a practical matter, since foster care regulations require the license be reasonably accessible for verification during exactly this kind of home visit. Sarah stopped walking, staring at the certificate for a long moment, her professional composure shifting into something I recognized, even before she spoke, as genuine, specific recognition. "I think I need to ask you something," Sarah said, turning to face me directly, her clipboard lowered slightly as though the formal, procedural portion of our interaction had, for a moment, given way to something more personal. "Are you the Danielle Cho who fostered the Ramirez sibling group 2 years ago?" I want to describe the specific disorientation of this question, given how completely it shifted the entire tenor of our interaction. "I am," I told her, genuinely unsure where this recognition might lead. "I placed those kids with you myself," Sarah said. "I remember your home from that placement. I remember how settled those kids became under your care, after everything they'd been through before that placement. I did not expect to be back here investigating a neglect complaint." I want to describe how this recognition began, almost immediately, shifting the specific texture of Sarah's investigation, because I think the professional, evidence-based nature of her subsequent approach mattered enormously to how quickly this situation began moving toward resolution. "I want to be clear," Sarah told me, "this recognition doesn't automatically resolve the investigation. I still need to conduct a thorough, fair assessment based on what I actually observed today, not just on your prior history with our office. But I'll be honest, given what I remember of your home and your care during that placement, the allegations in this report are already striking me as inconsistent with what I'm personally familiar with regarding your parenting." I appreciated her professional caution, even as her clear, growing skepticism toward the anonymous report offered a specific, genuine relief I hadn't expected to feel during what had begun as one of the most distressing mornings of my recent life. I want to describe a call I made during a brief break in Sarah's walkthrough, to a woman named Beverly who'd served as my mentor throughout my own foster parent licensing process years earlier, because her perspective helped me maintain composure during an otherwise genuinely frightening morning. "I need you to know this happens," Beverly told me, once I'd explained the situation in a hurried, anxious phone call from my bathroom while Sarah continued her assessment elsewhere in the house. "I've had 2 false reports filed against me over 15 years of fostering, both from people with their own unrelated grievances. It's genuinely awful to go through, but the process exists specifically to distinguish real concerns from exactly this kind of petty complaint. Stay calm, stay cooperative, and trust that a thorough investigation will show what's actually true." I found her specific, lived experience with this exact scenario genuinely steadying, understanding that I wasn't the first foster parent to face a fabricated allegation, and that the system, however initially frightening to encounter as its subject rather than its beneficiary, was generally designed to eventually surface the truth when a genuine, thorough investigation was actually conducted. "Document everything you can, once this is over," Beverly added. "Write down the timeline while it's fresh. You never know what might matter later." I want to describe the remainder of Sarah's investigation, because its actual findings mattered considerably to the eventual, formal resolution of this entire situation. Sarah continued her assessment with the same professional thoroughness, checking my refrigerator and pantry, which were, as always, well stocked with appropriate food for my children's ages and needs. She checked Maya and Ethan's bedrooms, both maintained in clean, age-appropriate condition, with clearly established routines visible in the organized clothing, consistent bedtime supplies, and general order of each space. She reviewed my emergency contact information, my documented childcare arrangements for the rare occasions I did need coverage, and my general household safety measures, all of it consistent with someone who took child safety and welfare seriously, rather than anything resembling the neglect described in the anonymous complaint. I want to describe the portion of Sarah's investigation that involved speaking directly with Maya and Ethan, since this component of the process represented a particularly important, and ultimately clarifying, part of the overall assessment. Following standard protocol, Sarah asked to speak with each of my children individually, without me present, to assess their own perspective on their home environment and daily care. I want to be honest that this portion of the process, while entirely appropriate and necessary, generated real anxiety in me, understanding how much weight would be placed on my children's own, unfiltered account of their daily lives. Sarah later told me, once these conversations had concluded, that both children had described a consistent, structured routine entirely inconsistent with the neglect allegations, regular meals, consistent supervision, a general sense of security and stability that, Sarah noted, is often genuinely difficult for children to convincingly fabricate if it doesn't actually reflect their real experience. I want to describe a conversation I had with Maya, my 9-year-old, after Sarah had left that day, because I think her own perspective on being interviewed offered a valuable window into how she'd experienced that portion of the process. "She asked me what we eat for dinner," Maya told me, describing her conversation with Sarah with the specific, matter-of-fact directness 9-year-olds often bring to describing unusual adult interactions. I told her about the meal schedule on the fridge, and how Tuesdays are always pasta night. She asked if I ever go without eating, and I told her that's never happened, not even once that I can remember. She also asked if I'm ever home alone for a long time, Maya continued. I told her you're always home when I get back from school, except that one time you had a work call and I watched a show for 20 minutes until you were done, but that's not really being alone, is it? I found myself genuinely moved, hearing Maya recount these details, understanding how completely her own honest, unprompted account of our actual routine had contradicted everything the anonymous report had claimed. "You did great," I told her. "You just told her the truth, and that's exactly what mattered." "Why did someone say we don't eat enough?" Maya asked, a question I hadn't yet found the right words to fully answer for her, understanding that explaining Linda's specific pettiness to my 9-year-old daughter required more careful thought than I'd yet had time to develop. I want to describe Sarah's preliminary assessment, delivered at the conclusion of this initial visit, because its clarity mattered enormously to my own understanding of where the investigation was likely heading. "Based on what I've observed today," she told me, I don't see any evidence supporting the specific allegations in this report. Your home is well maintained, your children appear healthy, well cared for, and consistent in their own accounts of their daily routine. I'll need to complete my formal documentation and follow our standard process, but I want to be honest with you that this visit has not raised any concerns on my part. I appreciated this candor considerably, even as I understood the investigation itself wasn't yet formally closed, requiring additional documentation and review before any final determination could be officially recorded. I want to address the question of the anonymous report's actual source, because while CPS investigations generally protect the identity of reporters, certain circumstances eventually made Linda's involvement considerably more apparent than she likely intended. I hadn't known, during Sarah's initial visit, who had actually filed the complaint against me. Anonymous reporting is a deliberate feature of the CPS system, designed to encourage people to report genuine concerns without fear of retaliation, a feature I fully understood and respected even as I found myself deeply curious about who might have constructed such a specific, fabricated account of my household. The connection to Linda became clear only later, through a combination of circumstantial details and, eventually, her own inadvertent admission during a conversation that I'll describe shortly. I want to describe the specific conversation during which Linda's involvement became apparent, because the circumstances of this revelation mattered to how I eventually processed and addressed the situation. About a week after Sarah's initial visit, Linda approached me in our shared driveway area, ostensibly to discuss an unrelated neighborhood matter. During this conversation, she made a comment, asking, with a specific, poorly concealed curiosity, whether everything had gotten sorted out with that whole CPS thing, a comment that referenced details about my situation that I hadn't shared with anyone in the neighborhood, given the private, sensitive nature of an active CPS investigation. I want to describe my own reaction to this comment, because the specific, immediate clarity of understanding exactly who must have made the report landed with a distinct, cold certainty. "How do you know about that?" I asked her directly, watching her expression shift, visibly, into something considerably more guarded. I want to describe what followed this direct question, because Linda's eventual, if reluctant, admission mattered to how I ultimately addressed the situation with her. "I might have mentioned some concerns to CPS," she said, her voice carrying a specific defensiveness that told me she understood, even in that moment, how poorly her actions would sound once stated plainly. "I just thought, given how things have looked sometimes, someone should look into it properly." "What things, specifically, looked concerning to you?" I asked her, genuinely wanting to understand what she believed she'd actually observed, given how completely disconnected her report's specific claims had been from my actual household reality. She struggled, visibly, to articulate any specific, concrete observations, eventually admitting that her complaint had been based more on general impressions and, she eventually acknowledged, lingering frustration about the earlier incident between our sons, than on any actual, sustained pattern of neglect she'd genuinely witnessed. I want to describe the rest of this conversation, because I think the specific accountability I sought from Linda mattered to how I ultimately processed the entire situation. "You made a formal report to CPS," I told her, claiming specific things, that I leave my children unsupervised for hours, that my home is unsanitary, that my kids appear hungry and inadequately dressed. "None of that is true, Linda. That's not a general impression. That's a specific, fabricated account of my household, made to an agency with the authority to remove my children from my care." Linda's composure finally broke, visibly, under the weight of hearing her actions described this plainly. "I didn't think about it like that," she said. "I think I was still upset about Ethan and my son, and it felt like a way to express that I thought you weren't handling things fairly, without having to say it to your face directly." I want to explain, directly, why Linda's specific actions carried such serious weight, beyond simply the personal discomfort of being falsely accused, because I think this context matters to understanding the full gravity of what she'd done. "I need you to understand something," I told her. "I'm a licensed foster parent. I've spent 4 years opening my home to children in genuine crisis, children who've experienced actual neglect and instability. False reports like yours don't just risk my own family's stability. They consume resources and attention that CPS caseworkers need for children experiencing real, genuine danger. You didn't just risk my custody of my own kids. You potentially delayed attention to a child somewhere else who might have needed it more urgently. I want to be honest that this specific framing landed with Linda in a way her initial confrontation with the direct facts of her fabrication hadn't quite managed to. Her expression shifted into something closer to genuine, if belated, horror at the broader implications of what she'd done. I want to describe the fuller acknowledgement Linda eventually offered, once she'd had time to sit with the actual weight of what her actions represented, because I think it mattered to how our relationship, however limited, continued afterward. I don't have a good excuse, she told me, several days after our initial confrontation, having apparently spent that time genuinely reflecting on what she'd done. I let a minor conflict between our kids turn into something I told myself was concern for your children's welfare, when really, it was just resentment I didn't know how to express directly. I'm genuinely sorry, and I understand if that apology doesn't undo the actual harm I caused. I want to describe something Linda shared during the same conversation, because I think it added an unexpected layer of context to understanding, though not excusing, why she'd resorted to something as serious as a fabricated CPS report over what was, ultimately, a minor childhood conflict. I think part of why I reacted the way I did, she admitted, is that my own mother was investigated once, when I was young, over a false report from a jealous relative. I remember how frightening it was, watching her go through that, even though nothing ever came of it. I think some part of me knew exactly how serious a tool this was, and I used it anyway, even understanding how much genuine fear it would cause you. I sat with this admission for a long moment, understanding it as a specific, if deeply troubling, insight, that Linda's own childhood experience with a false report hadn't taught her the harm of exactly this kind of accusation, but had instead, apparently, taught her precisely how effective a weapon it could be when deployed against someone she resented. That makes this worse, not better, I told her honestly. You knew exactly how frightening and serious this would be for me, from your own family's experience, and you did it anyway. I know, she said quietly. I've thought about that a lot since. I don't have a way to make that make more sense, or less troubling. I want to address the question of what formal consequences, if any, exist for someone who files a knowingly false CPS report, because several people who later heard this story asked me directly whether I'd pursued any legal action against Linda. I consulted with a lawyer, briefly, to understand my actual options. Filing a knowingly false report to Child Protective Services does constitute a legal violation in most jurisdictions, though pursuing formal charges requires demonstrating the reporter's knowing falsity rather than simply an unfounded but genuinely, if mistakenly, held concern. I ultimately decided not to pursue formal legal action against Linda, understanding that doing so would likely require considerable time and emotional energy, and that Linda's genuine, if belated, remorse, combined with the fact that Sarah's investigation had already formally cleared my name, represented sufficient resolution for the situation without extending it through additional legal conflict. I want to describe the formal closure of Sarah's investigation, because this official resolution mattered enormously to ensuring my record, both as a biological parent and as a licensed foster parent, remained fully, definitively clear going forward. Sarah's office issued a formal determination, several weeks after her initial visit, finding the neglect allegations entirely unsubstantiated, with specific documentation noting the thorough home assessment, the consistency of my children's own accounts, and my established, positive history as both a biological and foster parent within the county's system. I want to describe the specific relief of receiving this formal documentation, understanding that this official record would protect not just my peace of mind but my continued ability to foster additional children in the future, a possibility that a substantiated finding, however unjustly reached, could have seriously jeopardized regardless of the report's underlying falsity. I want to describe a conversation I had with Sarah, once her investigation had formally concluded, because her own professional reflection on this situation offered a broader perspective I found genuinely valuable. I want you to know, she told me, cases like this aren't as rare as people might assume. Neighbors, ex-partners, sometimes even extended family members file reports motivated by personal conflict rather than genuine child welfare concerns. It's part of why we take every report seriously regardless of how it originated, but it's also why thorough, careful investigation matters so much. A less careful process could have genuinely harmed your family, based on nothing more than a neighbor's unresolved resentment. I appreciated this perspective considerably, understanding it as confirmation of something I'd already believed, from my own experience within the foster care system, about the genuine importance of careful, evidence-based investigation, even when, especially when, an initial report sounds serious and specific. I want to describe, honestly, how my relationship with Linda evolved in the months following this incident, because I think the specific, careful nature of that evolution matters more than any simple, clean resolution would. We remain neighbors, and our interactions have settled into something considerably more distant than our previous, ordinary cordiality, though not entirely hostile. Linda has made occasional, small gestures suggesting genuine ongoing remorse, offering to help with yard work during a period I was dealing with a minor injury, being notably warmer toward Ethan in subsequent neighborhood interactions, small but specific efforts I've noticed without necessarily extending the same trust one once did before learning what she was capable of doing. People who hear this story sometimes expect me to say I moved away, or pursued Linda legally, or otherwise pursued a more dramatic resolution to this entire situation. I did neither, and I think it's more honest to say so, even though either more dramatic response might feel more satisfying to imagine. What actually happened was more measured, a false, seriously damaging report, motivated by petty, unresolved resentment over a minor childhood conflict, nearly destabilized my family and my standing within a foster care system I'd spent years genuinely serving. A caseworker's own direct, professional history with my home, combined with a thorough, evidence-based investigation, ultimately corrected the record definitively, though the underlying vulnerability, that anyone, motivated by any reason, can trigger this kind of serious, formal investigation, remains something I think about more now than I did before this happened. I found myself, in the months since this happened, sharing a version of this story with several other foster parents in my network, particularly those navigating their own complicated neighbor or extended family dynamics. Keep your documentation current and visible, I tell them, not because you expect to need it in exactly this way, but because you never know when a caseworker's own direct history with your home might matter more than you'd anticipate. I never imagined my foster license would become the specific detail that shifted an entire investigation. But it did, and I'm genuinely grateful for the specific, professional thoroughness that allowed that history to matter as much as it ultimately did. If there's a lesson in this, it's one I carry with me now every time I walk past that certificate hanging in my hallway, the same document that once, unexpectedly, became the exact detail that shifted an entire investigation from suspicion toward genuine, professional recognition. The actual truth of who I am, a parent who has spent years actively working to provide exactly the kind of stability and safety the anonymous report falsely claimed I was failing to provide my own children, ended up matching considerably more than any fabricated account, however specific and serious sounding, that a resentful neighbor could construct. I don't think Sarah walked into my home that day expecting to recognize my certificate, or to remember the specific children I'd once helped stabilize through my care. But she did, and that recognition, combined with a genuinely thorough investigation that would have vindicated me regardless, gave this entire situation a resolution I remain genuinely grateful for. I don't know if Linda fully understood, in the moment she filed that report, how seriously CPS investigations are conducted, or how close her petty resentment came to genuinely destabilizing a family that had done nothing to deserve it. But I know that the actual truth, documented, demonstrated, and ultimately recognized by someone with direct, professional knowledge of exactly who I am as a parent, settled the matter completely, the moment it was finally given the chance to. If you've ever been falsely accused of the exact thing you've actually spent years working against, I'd love to hear how the truth finally came out. Let me know in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one coming every week.